I thought I'd found paradise in our suburban home until I discovered that my husband and our neighbor were creating their own little heaven right under my nose. My name is Rebecca, and at 45, I believed I had achieved the American dream in our pristine neighborhood of Willowbrook Estates. My husband David worked as a senior marketing director, while I managed our household and freelanced as a graphic designer. Our neighbors, the Hartmans, seemed like the perfect couple. Richard, a successful business consultant, and his wife Melissa, a stunning yoga instructor who hosted book clubs in her immaculate living room. Our friendship with the Hartmans began innocently enough, with weekend barbecues and shared garden tips over the fence. But I started noticing strange coincidences that made my stomach twist with unease. Why did David always volunteer to help Melissa with her heavy lifting projects when Richard was traveling for work? Why did he suddenly develop an interest in yoga and ask about Melissa's class schedules with such intense curiosity? The first real warning sign came during a neighborhood block party when I caught David and Melissa sharing a lingering look across the dessert table. His hand briefly touched hers as they both reached for plates, and the electricity between them was unmistakable. When I mentioned it later, David laughed it off, calling me paranoid and suggesting I was reading too much into friendly gestures. But friendly gestures don't make your spouse blush like a teenager. The second red flag appeared when David started working late nights on projects that mysteriously coincided with Richard's business trips. Suddenly, my husband, who'd never shown interest in evening jogs, was taking long runs through the neighborhood, always returning sweaty and energized. When I offered to join him, he claimed he needed the alone time to clear his head. But whose head was he really trying to clear, and what thoughts was he trying to escape? Everything became crystal clear the night I returned early from my sister's birthday dinner to find David's car in our driveway and Melissa's yoga mat spread across our living room floor, along with clothing that definitely wasn't mine scattered across our couch. I didn't storm in or create a scene. Instead, I quietly took photos of the evidence and retreated to my car, my hands trembling as I realized my marriage had become a lie. But as I sat there processing the betrayal, I noticed something interesting. Richard's car pulling into his driveway, returning from what was supposed to be a 3-day business trip. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be the devastated wife crying alone in her kitchen. Instead, I was going to find out exactly how deep this betrayal went. And then I was going to make sure both David and Melissa understood that actions have consequences. But first, I needed to have a very interesting conversation with my neighbor Richard, who clearly had no idea his perfect wife was redecorating other people's living rooms.
Finding out your spouse is cheating is devastating, but discovering you have the perfect partner for revenge makes the betrayal almost worth it. The next morning, I watched Richard Hartman leave for his morning run, the same routine he'd maintained for the 3 years we'd been neighbors. But today, instead of waving from my kitchen window, I was waiting for him at the corner of Maple and Oak, armed with photographs that would shatter his world, just as mine had been shattered. "Richard, we need to talk," I said, falling into step beside him. His confused smile faded quickly when I handed him my phone showing the photos from the night before. His face went through a rainbow of emotions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally a cold determination that matched my own. "How long?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. I told him about the lingering looks, the convenient schedules, the sudden interest in yoga, and watched his jaw tighten with each revelation. What I discovered about Richard that morning changed everything. He wasn't just a successful business consultant. He was the CEO of Hartman Strategic Solutions, one of the largest corporate consulting firms on the East Coast. More importantly, his company was the primary sponsor for Sterling and Associates' annual gala, the event where David hoped to secure his promotion to vice president, the same gala where David had asked me to stay home because it would be boring for wives. Richard's laugh when I told him about David's request was chilling. Boring for wives. How interesting, considering Melissa specifically asked me not to attend this year because she wanted to network independently and thought my presence might overshadow her. We stood there in the morning sunlight, two betrayed spouses realizing we'd been played by people we'd trusted completely. But Richard had resources I never imagined. As CEO, he had access to Sterling and Associates' corporate records, their client information, and, most importantly, their employment contracts. "Rebecca," he said, his eyes gleaming with possibility, "what would you say to attending this gala as my guest? I think it's time David and Melissa learned about the consequences of mixing business with pleasure." Then Richard shared something that made my blood sing with anticipation. Sterling and Associates had a strict morality clause in their executive contracts, and David's affair with a client's wife, Richard's company had recently hired Melissa as their wellness consultant, constituted grounds for immediate termination and forfeiture of all benefits. "They want to play house behind our backs?" Richard said, his smile sharp as a blade. "Let's give them a housewarming party they'll never forget. I have some corporate announcements to make at this gala, and I think David and Melissa will be very interested in what I have to say." As we walked back toward our neighborhood, Richard and I began planning what would become the most memorable corporate gala in Sterling and Associates history. Two betrayed spouses with nothing left to lose and everything to gain were about to become the most dangerous partnership our cheating spouses had ever encountered.
They say knowledge is power. But as Richard and I uncovered the true scope of our spouse's deception, we realized we weren't just planning revenge, we were orchestrating justice. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard and I met daily under the guise of dealing with the neighborhood landscaping committee. But instead of discussing flower beds, we were digging up dirt that would bury both David and Melissa professionally and personally. What we discovered made their simple affair look like child's play compared to the web of deception they'd woven. Richard's investigation into Melissa's wellness consulting revealed she'd been billing his company for services never rendered while spending those paid hours in hotel rooms with David. She'd submitted fake invoices, fabricated client testimonials, and even charged the company for team building retreats that were actually romantic getaways with my husband. The woman I'd thought was teaching yoga was actually teaching graduate-level courses in corporate fraud. Meanwhile, my deep dive into David's recent behavior patterns revealed he'd been using Sterling and Associates' corporate credit cards for their affair expenses, romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and even couples spa treatments, all disguised as client entertainment expenses. He'd been stealing from his employer to fund his betrayal of our marriage, creating a paper trail that would make any HR director salivate with termination opportunities. But the most damaging discovery came when Richard accessed David's work emails through the corporate system. Their affair had been conducted partially through company servers, with explicit messages, nude photos, and detailed plans for their future all stored on Sterling and Associates' network. Every dirty message, every stolen moment, every lie they'd told was documented in corporate files that Richard, as the company's primary sponsor, had every right to review. The emails revealed something that made my stomach turn. They'd been laughing at us. David called me the warden and joked about how easy it was to fool clueless Rebecca with his transparent lies. Melissa referred to Richard as the ATM and mocked his devotion to their marriage, calling him pathetically trusting for believing her fabricated business trips. They'd turned our love into their private joke. Then we found the email that changed everything. David and Melissa's detailed plan to sabotage both our marriages at the corporate gala by publicly humiliating us and announcing their relationship, forcing us into divorce proceedings that would allow them to start fresh with the money they'd been stealing from Richard's company and David's employer. "They want to make a public announcement at the gala," Richard said, his smile predatory as a shark's. "Perfect. I love public announcements. As the event's primary sponsor, I'll make sure they get exactly the audience they deserve."
Planning the perfect revenge requires the same attention to detail as planning a wedding, except instead of promising to love and honor, you're promising to expose and destroy. 3 days before the gala, Richard and I had transformed from betrayed spouses into corporate warfare strategists. Every detail was planned with military precision. The legal documents prepared by Richard's corporate attorneys, the evidence packets ready for distribution, and most importantly, our grand entrance that would catch David and Melissa completely off guard. I spent hours selecting the perfect dress, a stunning emerald green gown that David had always said made me look absolutely devastating. Tonight, devastating was exactly what I intended to be, but not in the way he'd ever imagined. Richard looked distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, every inch the successful CDO who was about to remind everyone exactly who held the real power in this corporate relationship. The most delicious part of our preparation was watching David and Melissa's increasing excitement about their planned announcement. David had been practically glowing for days, convinced he was about to secure his promotion, while simultaneously revealing his new relationship. Melissa had been dropping hints to neighbors about big changes coming and how some people deserve to be happy. They had no idea they were planning their own professional execution. Richard's legal team had prepared termination documents for both David and Melissa, along with cease and desist orders, fraud charges, and breach of contract claims. The evidence was overwhelming. Corporate credit card abuse, misuse of corporate resources, theft of services, and violation of morality clauses in both their employment contracts. They'd been so busy stealing from our marriages, they'd forgotten to cover their tracks in their professional thievery. But the crown jewel of our preparation was Richard's surprise announcement as the gala's keynote speaker. As CEO of the event's primary sponsor, he'd been invited to address the crowd about integrity in corporate relationships. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine intervention. Richard would indeed be talking about integrity, just not in the way anyone expected. The night before the gala, David actually asked me to help him pick out the perfect tie for his important presentation. I smiled sweetly and selected the red silk tie I'd given him for our anniversary, knowing that it would be the last tie he'd ever wear as an employee of Sterling & Associates. "You look so handsome," I told David as I adjusted his tie that final morning, and I meant it. He looked perfect for what was about to happen, dressed for success, confident in his deception, completely unprepared for his downfall. As David left for what he thought would be his triumphant evening, I began my own transformation. Tonight, I wouldn't be the ignored wife sitting at home while her husband celebrated his betrayal. Instead, I'd be the guest of honor at the most memorable corporate event in Sterling & Associates history, arriving on the arm of the man who held their future in his hands. Walking into that corporate gala on Richard's arm felt like stepping onto a stage where I was about to deliver the performance of a lifetime, and David had no idea he was the audience for his own destruction. The Sterling & Associates annual gala was held at the Grand Ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel, sparkling with crystal chandeliers and filled with the city's corporate elite. As Richard and I approached the entrance, I could see David through the windows, mingling confidently with colleagues, his hand occasionally brushing Melissa's back as she worked the room in a dress I'd never seen before. The moment we stepped into the ballroom, conversations began to shift and heads turned to follow our entrance. Richard Hartman was corporate royalty in this crowd, and his presence commanded immediate attention. But it was my presence beside him that sent shockwaves through the room, especially when David caught sight of us across the crowded dance floor. David's face went through a fascinating transformation when he saw me. Confusion, panic, and then desperate calculation as he tried to understand why his wife was attending the gala he'd specifically told me to avoid.
Melissa's reaction was even more entertaining. She actually choked on champagne when she realized her husband was not only at the event, but had brought me as his date. Richard, David approached us with forced joviality, his voice pitched higher than usual. What a wonderful surprise! I had no idea you were attending tonight. Richard's smile was perfectly cordial as he shook David's hand, but I could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world. After all, Hartman Strategic Solutions is the primary sponsor. I have some very important announcements to make tonight. The blood drained from Melissa's face as she realized her husband wasn't just attending, he was the evening's keynote speaker. All their carefully laid plans for their public announcement were crumbling as they realized they'd been outmaneuvered by the two people they thought they could manipulate indefinitely. "David," Richard said pleasantly, "I hope you don't mind, but I've asked Rebecca to be my guest this evening. After reviewing some recent business matters, I thought it was important that both our families be represented tonight." The emphasis he placed on business matters made David's hands visibly shake. As the evening's program began, Richard and I took our seats at the head table, the sponsors table, while David and Melissa were relegated to a table in the back, suddenly realizing they were no longer the evening's stars, but its targets. Looking out over the crowd of David's colleagues and superiors, all hanging on every word from the man who controlled their largest contract, I felt a rush of power I'd never experienced. Tonight, justice wouldn't just be served, it would be catered by the finest hotel in the city, with David and Melissa as the unwilling guests of honor. There's nothing quite like watching your cheating spouse realize they've been played by the two people they thought were too weak to fight back, especially when that realization happens in front of their entire professional world. As dinner was served, Richard stood to make his keynote address, his commanding presence immediately silencing the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Tonight, I want to talk about integrity, trust, and the sacred bonds that hold our professional relationships together." I watched David's face grow paler with each word as Richard began describing the importance of honesty in business partnerships. "When someone violates that trust," Richard continued, "when they abuse their position for personal gain, when they steal not just money, but the very foundation of professional relationships, there can be only one response." The room was dead silent, hanging on every word. Recently, Hartman Strategic Solutions discovered that one of our wellness consultants has been billing us for services never rendered, submitting fraudulent invoices, and using our company resources for personal affairs. Melissa's champagne glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. Richard's voice never wavered as he continued. "Furthermore, we discovered that this fraud was enabled by an employee of Sterling and Associates who used corporate credit cards and company resources to facilitate these crimes. This individual violated every principle of professional conduct while betraying the trust of both our companies." The audience was riveted, unaware they were witnessing the most spectacular corporate takedown in the industry's history. David tried to stand, perhaps thinking he could escape, but Richard's next words froze him in place. These individuals used their positions of trust to steal from their employers while conducting an affair that violated multiple employment contracts and fiduciary responsibilities. Therefore, Richard announced, effective immediately, Hartman Strategic Solutions is terminating all contracts with Melissa Hartman for fraud, breach of contract, and theft of services. Additionally, we are recommending that Sterling and Associates terminate David Morrison for violation of corporate policies, misuse of company resources, and breach of his executive employment agreement. The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers as everyone turned to stare at David and Melissa, who sat frozen at their table like deer caught in headlights. Richard had just publicly destroyed both their careers in front of every important person in their professional lives. As Richard returned to his seat beside me, he placed a gentle hand on mine and smiled. "Sometimes," Richard whispered, "the best business presentation is simply telling the truth." David and Melissa's perfect evening had become their perfect nightmare, and we were just getting started.
Watching your enemies realize that their public humiliation was just the opening act of their destruction is almost as satisfying as knowing you orchestrated every devastating moment. As Richard finished his speech, servers throughout the ballroom began distributing what appeared to be elegant corporate folders to specific tables. But these weren't program materials. They were legal documents delivered with surgical precision to David's supervisors, Melissa's former clients, and every executive who needed to understand the legal implications of what they'd just witnessed. David's immediate supervisor, James Crawford, opened his folder to find David's termination papers, complete with detailed evidence of corporate credit card fraud, misuse of company resources, and violation of his executive morality clause. The documentation was overwhelming. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, spa treatments, all paid for with company funds, while David claimed they were client entertainment expenses. Melissa's clients received copies of her fraudulent invoices, fake testimonials, and billing records that she'd charged for wellness seminars she'd never conducted while she was actually in hotel rooms with David. Her professional reputation crumbled in real time as executives realized they'd been paying premium rates for services that existed only on fabricated paperwork. But the most devastating folder went to the CEO of Sterling & Associates, containing not just the evidence of David's financial crimes, but also screenshots of emails where David mocked the company's outdated morality policies and bragged about how easy it was to manipulate expense reports. His contempt for his employer was documented in his own words. The legal papers weren't just termination notices. They were breach of contract claims, demands for restitution, and cease and desist orders prohibiting David and Melissa from contacting their former employers or clients. Richard's legal team had crafted a comprehensive legal assault that would destroy both their careers and their finances simultaneously. Then came the personal service of divorce papers. As David sat in stunned silence, a process server approached our table and formally served him with divorce documents that I'd filed that afternoon. The same performance was repeated at Melissa's table, where she received her own divorce papers from Richard. The ballroom watched in fascination as David and Melissa realized they weren't just losing their jobs, they were losing their marriages, their homes, and their financial security, all in the same evening. Their affair had cost them everything they'd worked decades to build. As security escorted David and Melissa from the hotel, they were no longer welcome at the corporate event after being terminated. I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. Justice wasn't just served, it was presented with a bow on top and witnessed by everyone who mattered in their professional lives.
The morning after the gala, David and Melissa woke up unemployed, divorced, and facing lawsuits. But their nightmare was just beginning as the corporate world closed ranks against them. Within 24 hours of the gala, word of David and Melissa's spectacular downfall had spread throughout the corporate community like wildfire. The story was too scandalous, too perfectly executed, and too thoroughly documented to remain contained within Sterling & Associates and Hartman Strategic Solutions. David's attempts to find new employment hit immediate roadblocks as news of his corporate fraud spread through professional networks. His LinkedIn profile became a cautionary tale, with former colleagues distancing themselves and potential employers conducting additional background checks that invariably led to polite rejections. The marketing industry is surprisingly small, and David's reputation preceded him everywhere he applied. Melissa faced an even worse fate in the wellness industry, where trust and integrity are fundamental to client relationships. Her fraudulent consulting practices became a case study in professional ethics violations, shared in industry newsletters and conference presentations as an example of what not to do. Corporate wellness coordinators warned each other in private Facebook groups and professional forums. But the real devastation came when their mortgage company, credit card companies, and other creditors learned about their employment terminations and pending lawsuits. Without corporate salaries and facing significant legal judgments, both David and Melissa found themselves in financial freefall with no safety net to catch them. Their attempts to reconcile with their spouses, their employers, or their clients were met with contempt and legal barriers. Richard and I had been thorough in our destruction, ensuring that every bridge they might use to rebuild their lives was systematically burned. They'd wanted to start fresh together, but fresh starts required clean slates, and theirs were permanently stained. The most poetic justice came when David and Melissa tried to sue us for defamation and wrongful interference, only to discover that truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. Every statement Richard had made at the gala was backed by documentary evidence, and their lawsuit only gave us another platform to present their crimes to a wider audience. Their legal team abandoned them when they realized David and Melissa had no assets left to pay legal fees, and their case had no merit. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't file again, and they were ordered to pay our legal costs. 6 months after the gala, Richard and I watched from our respective new apartments as moving trucks cleaned out both the Morrison and Hartman houses. David and Melissa had lost everything: their careers, their marriages, their homes, and their reputations. They'd finally gotten the fresh start they'd wanted, but it looked nothing like what they'd dreamed of.
Sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't what you do to your enemies. It's watching them destroy themselves while trying to escape the consequences of their choices. 1 year after the gala that ended their careers, David and Melissa's legal troubles had multiplied beyond their worst nightmares. The civil suits from their former employers had resulted in judgments totaling over $400,000 in damages, restitution, and legal fees. But their attempts to avoid paying these judgments only made their situation worse. David tried to declare bankruptcy to avoid paying Sterling and Associates, but bankruptcy courts don't discharge debts incurred through fraud. His financial crimes were considered willful and malicious, making the debt non-dischargeable. Every attempt to escape his obligations only added more legal fees and court sanctions to his growing mountain of debt. Melissa's situation was even more dire. Her fraudulent consulting had affected multiple companies, and each one filed separate lawsuits seeking damages. Her professional liability insurance was voided due to her fraudulent practices, leaving her personally responsible for every penny. She was forced to sell her jewelry, her car, and even her yoga equipment to pay legal fees. Their relationship, built on stolen moments and shared deception, crumbled under the pressure of their mutual destruction. Without jobs, money, or hope, they turned on each other with vicious blame and recrimination. David accused Melissa of seducing him into the affair, while Melissa claimed David had manipulated her into committing fraud. Their love story became a bitter legal battle over who was more responsible for their shared downfall. The final blow came when the IRS audited both their tax returns, discovering that they'd failed to report the fraudulent income as taxable earnings. Tax evasion charges were added to their legal troubles, ensuring that even if they managed to rebuild their careers, the government would be waiting to collect its share of their illegal gains. David's attempt to reconcile with me backfired spectacularly when he showed up at my apartment begging for forgiveness, only to be served with a restraining order and additional legal papers. His violation of the no-contact clause in our divorce agreement cost him his visitation rights with our children and added contempt of court charges to his legal troubles. The final court hearing was almost anticlimactic. David and Melissa, representing themselves because they couldn't afford attorneys, sat at the defendant's table looking hollow and defeated. The judge's ruling was swift and merciless. They owed full restitution, court costs, and punitive damages. Their wages would be garnished for the next decade, assuming they could find employment. As I left the courthouse that final time,
I realized that David and Melissa had received exactly what they'd earned. Nothing. They'd traded stable marriages and successful careers for stolen moments that became stolen years, and their greed had left them with empty hands and empty futures. They say living well is the best revenge. But as I stood in my new life, surrounded by people who valued honesty and loyalty, I realized that living authentically is the ultimate victory over those who tried to destroy you with lies. 2 years after the gala that changed everything, I stood in the sunlight streaming through the windows of my new townhouse, a space that belonged entirely to me and contained no memories of betrayal or deception. The divorce settlement had been generous. David's pension, half the house proceeds, and ongoing spousal support that would continue until his debts were satisfied, which looked to be approximately forever. Rebuilding my life hadn't been without challenges. Some mutual friends had initially blamed me for David's excessive punishment, claiming I should have handled the affair privately rather than destroying his career so publicly. But time revealed their true loyalties, as the same people who criticized my methods were quietly grateful when David's corporate fraud investigation uncovered his theft from their retirement accounts as well. My freelance graphic design business had flourished in ways I'd never imagined possible. Word of my role in exposing corporate fraud had spread through business networks, and companies began hiring me specifically because they trusted my integrity. Clients knew that someone who'd exposed her own husband's crimes would never compromise their corporate interests for personal gain. Richard and I had developed an unexpected friendship through our shared experience. Not romantic, we'd both learned valuable lessons about trust and were taking time to heal, but a deep mutual respect for people who keep their promises and honor their commitments. We met occasionally for coffee, sharing updates on our new lives, and laughing about how our former spouses had underestimated our resolve. The most satisfying update came when I learned that David and Melissa had finally found employment. David as a night shift security guard, and Melissa as a retail associate at a discount clothing store. Their combined income barely covered their basic living expenses, with most of their earnings going to legal judgments and garnished wages. But the true victory wasn't their downfall. It was my rise. At 57, I was more successful, more confident, and more genuinely happy than I'd been in the final years of my marriage. I discovered that the woman who emerged from David's betrayal was stronger, wiser, and more valuable than the one he'd taken for granted. Recently, I received a letter from David, forwarded through my attorney to avoid violating the restraining order, begging for forgiveness and claiming he'd learned his lesson. I returned it unopened, because some lessons are too expensive to repeat, and some forgiveness would only enable future harm. David and Melissa had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. As for me, I was living with the satisfaction of knowing that justice, when properly served, tastes better than any revenge could ever feel. They'd tried to steal my life, but instead, they'd freed me to build something better than I'd ever imagined possible.